All right, everybody, it is 4:04, so I think it's time that we get started. So thank you all so much for coming on. This is an incredibly special event for all of us. I'm very appreciative that all of you could make it. I know it's a beautiful day. I know that finals are coming up soon, so I'm very happy to introduce Noam Chomsky to the Lewis and Clark Psychology Club. I don't think Chomsky needs an introduction, but I'll give him one anyway. So Chomsky is known for a lot of things, including linguistics and cognitive science, as well as politics too. So yeah, we thought he would make a fantastic speaker. So Noam, thank you so much for coming on. It truly is an honor to have you here. So thank you. Um, you should be able to unmute now. Sorry, I made you a co-host. This whole thing's confusing.
How's that? Is that working?
It works. Yes, I can hear you. All right, wonderful. One moment. All right, Noam. So my first question for you is, I would love to know the origins of your interest in studying language. I would love to know if you had any kind of early experiences in your life that led you to be curious in language and the formation of language, or if it occurred to you during your studies or studying under Zelig Harris.
You want to know the actual story?
I would really like to know this. Yes.
Okay. I hated high school. I went to an academic high school, Central High in Philadelphia, which was the school for kids who were going to go to college. Very boring. I was looking forward to college. I went to Penn. Those days you went to the local school. The idea of going anywhere didn't arise. The catalog looked very exciting. I thought it'd be great. First year was almost total bore. I was planning to drop out when I, through other contacts, political contacts, I happened to run into Zelig Harris, who was the professor of linguistics there, and in fact, the major theoretical linguist in the world, probably, but I didn't know anything about that. Got to know him, talked about other things. He suggested that I start taking his graduate courses. Gave me a book to read. It was a book of his that was in press. He said, you can read this and proofread it if you want. So I proofread the book, and that was about enough of an introduction. And I realized later he was probably trying to talk me into going back to college, but didn't go up at the time. He suggested I start taking graduate courses in other fields where I had no background, but the faculty, they were very good people. They were willing to let me in. So I actually never had an undergraduate education, except kind of sporadically. It was a pretty loose place in those days. I was able to just take grad courses in philosophy and math, the things I was interested in. That's how I got into linguistics.
If you could describe some of the different approaches you've taken throughout the years to studying languages, and if you could talk about what challenges are associated with those approaches, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Really interested in the nature of language, theory of language. What is it that enables us to be able to do what we're doing right now? What biological property do we have that no other organism in the world, probably the universe, has that is enabling us to do this remarkable thing? It's a thing, what we're doing has, you look back at the history, which was not known at that time, it's been discovered since. This goes back to these interests go back to the early days of the scientific revolution. So Galileo and his people, contemporaries, were awed and amazed by what they regarded as a miraculous fact correctly. How is it that with just a few symbols, we can construct infinitely many thoughts and even somehow convey to others who have no access to our minds the inner workings of our minds? Galileo himself thought that the alphabet was the most stupendous of all human inventions, surpassing everything else because it was one way to enable this miracle. So what is it about us that enables us to do this? and there are two, by now we can say a fair amount. There are two fundamental species properties of human beings. Species properties in that they're universal. All humans have them in pretty much the same manner, apart from severe pathology. And no other organism has anything remotely like them. One of them is language, the other is thought. And the two are very closely linked because language is the means for constructing and expressing thought. Now, there happens to be a rich tradition, which was long forgotten. It's been rediscovered more recently, that investigated these matters through the 19th century. By the 20th century, it was wiped out by behaviorism and structuralism, which weren't interested in these questions. But the tradition took the view that language is what was called audible thought. We now know it doesn't have to be audible. In fact, you don't even have to externalize it, and other sensory motor media work just as well. But if you want to think about a familiar analog, it's kind of like your laptop. There's a stored program inside your laptop. It can use any printer. It doesn't care. The externalization say we're now using speech and hearing, but it doesn't matter. We could use a different one. The internal program doesn't care. So the question is, what's the internal program? Well, actually, the tradition was never really able to answer this question because the relevant concepts weren't there. They were created in the mid-20th century by the theory of computability, the work of Alan Turing, Alonzo Church, Kurt Gödel, and others developed clearly and explicitly the ideas that underlie all theory of computation, including your laptop, the way in which a finite mechanism like the brain can create infinitely many objects and determine their specific properties. For language, that means infinitely many structured expressions, each of which has a particular meaning, and each of which can be, but need not be, externalized into some sensory motor medium. So that's the topic that for theoretical linguistics and biological linguistics, that's what you want to study. This is a property of human biology. So what is it? And how does it achieve this remarkable result?
Excellent. So my next question is, what do you think that the most important problems that are yet to be solved in linguistics are going forward in the future?
There are immediate problems that arise, very serious ones, and they seem to be contradictory. One thing is that whatever's in our head has to be rich enough so that it can account for the leap from data presented to knowledge attained. It was very clear then, and it's overwhelmingly clear now, that what a 2-year-old child knows is way beyond any experience that it's ever had. You can now, experimental work and language acquisition has shown quite convincingly that 2 or 3-year-old children have basically mastered the basics of their language, including some quite remarkable and surprising properties. It's impossible that any of that was learned. So you have to have a very rich internal system to account for the leap from very scattered data and limited data to very rich knowledge. On the other hand, this system has to have evolved. And in order to have evolved, it must be simple enough to have evolved. And we now know that the evolution of language took place within a pretty brief window. It's not certain, but there's pretty strong evidence that language emerged pretty much along with human beings, Homo sapiens. That's an instant of evolutionary time. and it hasn't changed since. So we know that it hasn't changed in about 150,000 years. There's genomic evidence that humans began to scatter about that period, and they all have the same language faculty, so it hasn't changed. And there's no evidence at all for any meaningful symbolic activity before Homo sapiens shows up about 200 or 300,000 years ago. In evolutionary time, this is a flick of an eye. So we have a conundrum. It seems that the system must be rich enough, very rich, in order to account for acquisition, and very impoverished in order to account for evolution. And that conundrum has pretty much driven the program of theoretical linguistics, at least for people like me, ever since the origins. And we're now kind of getting to the point where we're getting a grasp on the answer, how you could have a simple system, simple enough to have evolved very quickly and in a particular form, which does yield many of the fundamental properties of language. It's an exciting moment for that reason. But over the years, the main problem has been, if you go back to 1950, it was generally assumed that essentially all the problems were solved. When I was a student, there was nothing much to learn. You learned methods of data analysis. Language is considered to be what was called a matter of habit and training. So there's nothing to say about maybe conditioning. There was nothing to say about acquisition. The only task that remained was to apply the methods that are available to the data of different languages. And it was assumed explicitly that languages could just differ in any possible way. So the field was essentially finished until you started asking these questions, in which case it turned out that you knew nothing, not everything, but nothing. It had nothing to do with habit and training. They don't even apply. There's virtually no training, no habit. There's the questions that I just raised immediately arise. As soon as you begin to look at the simplest expressions of language, all kinds of problems arise for which there's no answer, and which infants already know the answer to. Well, you begin looking at that, and you find endless questions, including a solution to the conundrum that I just mentioned, which is quite serious. It was pretty similar in biology, I should say. If you go back to the 1950s, it was generally assumed that biological organisms could differ in any imaginable way. We now know that that's radically false. The structure of biological organisms is extremely limited, so limited, in fact, that there's even proposals taken seriously that there's a universal genome, which is slightly tweaked to give one or another possible organism, but within a very narrow set of options. That's what we're learning about language too. All of what was psychology in the 1950s has been totally thrown out. There's no conditioning, there's no association, there's no training. None of that has anything to do with acquisition of language or our other capacities.
There are a lot of people here, so I would love to open the floor to questions. So if anyone could just raise their hands, I will do my best to call on people and answer as many questions as we can.
I'm curious if the anarchistic tendencies of the Zapatista movement could be replicated today. Yes.
What about them?
I'm curious if the tendencies of the movement could be replicated today in some of the revolutionary corners of the world, and if you think that they're being replicated today.
There are a fair number of things like it, which are not too well known, but quite significant. So, for example, the major popular movement in the world, which is organized sort of on the line similar to the Zapatistas, is more developed, is the MST in Brazil, the landless workers movement. Huge number of people. They take over unused lands. They usually have to fight off the police and the army and others, but they've succeeded in many places. And they've established an extensive, rich cooperative community. It's a combination of indigenous people and campesinos, poor campesinos. They've gotten to the point of developing not only extensive agriculture, but also industry, schools, other institutions, all cooperative, all participatory, economically very successful, entering into the outside economy, selling things and so on. It's an enormous movement, constantly under attack, of course. Brazil is a country pretty much run by very narrow, wealthy elite, a lot of them landowners, and of course they don't like this. So there's constant battles, but it's extended. So that's one case. There are others less extensive. The Zapatistas are surviving. It's very hard to find out a lot about them, though there's some evidence because the areas are pretty much closed to entry. Again, the government isn't very happy about the fact that Chiapas has been taken over by local indigenous people.
Hi there. I was wondering, Mr. Chomsky, given your own historic personal choices, how realistic you think it is today for one person to make a difference in the world?
Well, Margaret Mead had a nice statement about that, which she said better than I could. But that's most of what happens, is one or a small number of people making a difference. Let me give you a recent example. The most important issue that human beings face today, in fact, that they had ever faced in human history, is environmental catastrophe. It's a terribly serious problem. If we don't solve it in a couple of decades, human society is basically finished. No question like that has ever arisen before. It's going to be the task of this generation to decide whether organized human society survives. Now, there are ways to deal with it. They're known. They're one or another version of a Green New Deal, it's called. You go back 4 or 5 years, it was way off. If the idea was even mentioned, it was ridiculed. Now it's on the legislative agenda, not in a strong enough form, but at least something. What happened? Well, a group of young activists, Sunrise Movement, were very actively engaged in this issue, along with many other young people. Sunrise Movement finally decided to occupy congressional offices to try to compel them to take on a Green New Deal. They occupied Nancy Pelosi's office. Ordinarily, you just get thrown out. And the police come, toss you out. But this time was different. They got some support from some of the young representatives who came in on the Sanders wave, especially Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez came in and supported them, so didn't get thrown out. Extended to some support from a Massachusetts senator, Ed Markey, senior senator, who'd been interested in environmental issues for years. He managed to get it looked at by the Senate. Pretty soon you get Biden's program, which is way better than anything before it. Not enough, but something. Well, who accomplished this? I mean, the immediate roots were a handful of people. Of course, there's a background of extensive organizing and activism. But yes, a few people can make an enormous difference. If they hadn't done it, we'd be heading for disaster. And you can find this all over the place. Take, say, the civil rights movement. We think about Martin Luther King and the March on Washington and I Have a Dream and so on. A lot went into that. Things like 60 years ago in Greensboro, North Carolina, 4 Black kids, 4, decided to go into a Woolworths segregated lunchroom, sat down, asked to be served. Of course, the police came, arrested them, threw them out. Could have been the end, except that the next day more Black students came. And pretty soon others came. Pretty soon you had SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Originally, Black students in the South, later some Northern students joined, started sending freedom buses through places like Alabama, which is murder. And many of them were killed, in fact. They were trying to get Black farmers to agree to take the risk of registering to vote, which meant facing the threat of lynching, having your house destroyed, and so on. It's better now, but not that much better. But yes, they managed to do that. Pretty soon more came. Pretty soon you had a big movement. You could get the national mobilization. There was a fairly sympathetic administration, so Johnson managed to ram through some civil rights legislation over the strong objection of a lot of Congress. Was a step forward, by no means enough. Well, that's how everything happens. So the answer to your question is not only can it be done, but it's the only way.
Excellent answer.
Thank you.
I think Alana was the next hand I saw, so you should be able to unmute.
Yeah, thank you. So, Mr. Chomsky, it's really an honor to meet you. I have a question. So, I come from Bosnia and Herzegovina, and which might clarify to you why I am asking. Do you think there is a solution to nationalism?
For nationalism?
Yes.
Actually, nationalism is a pretty recent phenomenon.
Really?
It is. It started in the 19th century. Take Europe. Go back to the 19th century. You didn't have nations. You had a few, but not very many. And take, say, Italy, for example. Italy just began its move towards becoming a nation under great pressure in the 19th century, late 19th century. In fact, Italy still is barely a nation. You go to Italy today, you find plenty of people who can't talk to their grandmothers because their grandmothers speak different languages. They're called dialects, but they're in fact mutually unintelligible languages. Well, Italy's begun to congeal as a nation very recently. Yet now the younger people in Italy have a national language. They all speak something which was once a dialect of Florence, but most they pick it up from television, school, and so on. Well, so that's beginning to put Italy together as a nation, but very much broken up. At the Northern League, the rich northern areas, they don't want to have anything to do with those poor people in Sicily. Actually, I had a grad student, an Italian grad student, a couple of years, about maybe 20 years ago, who always identified herself as French. When I got to know her, I found out she lived near the French border in northern Italy, and she didn't want to be associated with Italians. She preferred to be identified as French, which is not unrealistic. You go back 100 years, there was no border. I mean, if you looked at languages, for example, they just moved slowly from Paris down to Italy with slight changes, no real border. The same in Germany. Give you another example. This is about 50 years ago. A student of mine, grad student at MIT, was in linguistics, was working on German. And he wanted to go to Germany afterwards just to polish up his German, work in Germany. So he managed to get a job in Cologne. His job was teaching German to German students because the dialect they spoke was so different from standard German that they were almost mutually unintelligible. Well, now if you go to Cologne, everybody speaks standard German, but that's recent notice. And the same is true of the other aspects of nationalism. They've congealed over the years, but it's pretty much a modern development. And when we want to know what it is, it's pretty obscure. So we're having that battle right here in the United States. Countries being torn apart over that. There's a large part of the country feels that they're losing their country. You go to the people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th, who've by now been studied pretty intensively. The main thrust was our country's being taken away from us. I don't recognize our country. It's not mine. I come from a place which was Christian, white. The colored people knew their place. They didn't bother us. There weren't minorities around. Everybody went to church on Sunday. We all knew each other. There were jobs for the younger people. It's gone. They don't have that anymore. They're taking our country away from us. We want it back. Well, that's a breakdown of a loosely structured nationalism. It's a very fragile thing. In fact, take Europe today. The European Union is a small step towards some kind of federation, the same kind that took place in the United States, not easily. I mean, the phrase United States was plural, not singular, until the Civil War. It was a bunch of states that were united. And in other languages like Spanish, it's still Estados Unidos. It's a plural word. In the Civil War, by extreme violence, a nation was established. Still hasn't been accepted by much of the South. 150 years or 70 years later. Well, that's how nations get established, mostly by force and violence, with plenty of resistance. So can nationalism be overcome? I think it's a very thin form of association. It's not the natural form of association for people. In Europe, it's a recent development in Europe, and it's already beginning to erode, like the Schengen Agreement in the European Union, which allows free travel from one country to another without borders. And that also allows, say, an Italian college student to go take his graduate work in Germany or something like that. It's already the beginning of the erosion of borders. And you find that everywhere. They go to the Middle East. The nations that were established in the Middle East are very recent, and they were established by imperial force. That's one of the reasons for the enormous conflicts in the region. People were stuck together who have nothing to do with each other. So take, say, Iraq. Iraq is a tribal society. The British drew the borders so as to bar Turkey from having access to the oil fields of the north. And they cut out Kuwait in the south so that the new country they were creating wouldn't have an access to the sea, so they'd be able to control it better. And that's in the 1920s. It's a century ago. It's never actually been instituted properly. There's still a war. Take Africa. You look at the borders in Africa, plenty of straight lines. Why should they have straight lines? Because that's the way the imperial powers were able to rule the area. Again, putting people together who had nothing to do with each other. But it was useful for the imperial powers. India and Pakistan. And Britain decided to separate two countries where there was no border. Take Pakistan and Afghanistan. There are people who we call terrorists who go from Pakistan to Afghanistan. They never recognized that border, the Durand Line. The border was imposed by the British for their own purposes. The people who live on both sides of the border never recognized it. In fact, even the states never recognized it. Just straight imperial violence. Okay, it lasts long enough, it'll turn into nations. Then they may erode. So I think the answer to your question is interesting but complex. These are not things that are graven in stone. They can be modified. They're, in fact, collapsing right before our eyes, even in our own country.
Thank you.
All right.
Just add one thing, one comment. I happen to live in Tucson. Sometimes when I'm talking in courses on politics, I sometimes describe where we're living as occupied Mexico. There's a good reason for that. For one thing, a large part of the population is Mexican American. For another thing, I'm living in the United States because the United States is a more violent and brutal society than Mexico was. So it was able to conquer half of Mexico. Arizona, New Mexico, California, all conquered by violence. And they knew what they were doing. General Grant, Ulysses S. Grant, President Grant, served in the army during the war. He regretted it all his life. He described the conquest of Mexico as one of the most wicked wars in history. Okay, so we're now in the United States, not in Mexico, thanks to violence. You look around the world, that's what you see in most places.
So I have it written down. Much of your life work has been centered around illuminating the information and propaganda monopoly resting in the hands of massive corporate enterprises. However, with the proliferation of social media, the bar to access a platform that allows for anyone to espouse ideas, instantly share information, etc., has been significantly lowered and in some places virtually eliminated. How do you see this as having effectively changed political dynamics in the present and going forward? And do you view it as a positive thing for working class and other people's movements?
It's a complicated business, but let's start with a simple question. Suppose that you get your news from Facebook, as a lot of young people do. What are you reading on Facebook? Well, you're reading an edited version of what showed up in the national media. What shows up in the national media is itself a framed, shaped version of what's actually happening in the world. You're getting a watered down version of that from Facebook with more editorial changes and modification and distortion. So you're getting a bit, and Facebook doesn't have reporters out in the field, doesn't have a news bureau in Pakistan and so on. So they're accumulating, shaping, modifying things. But the major sources of information are the same as before. It's the major mass media. Can be, social media have had an effect. They enable you to express your opinion. The internet, if people use it effectively, enables you to get many other sources of information. So if you want to understand things about Latin America, you can go to what's maybe the best newspaper in the Western Hemisphere, La Jornada in Mexico, a rare newspaper that isn't owned by wealthy capital. In fact, business refuses even to advertise in it because they hate it. It's a very good newspaper run by the journalists, a lot of interesting material in it. You can go to Europe and get a European newspaper, you can get Al Jazeera, you can get lots of sources. So you can get a kind of triangulation on what's happening in the world if you use it. If you're just looking at Facebook and your favorite social media, you're not going to get that. what you're going to get, what actually happens pretty much is that kind of a natural tendency to go look at the places on social media that more or less have your opinion. So you hear modifications of your opinion, extended, modified, you contribute to them, ends up with people in bubbles who aren't even talking to each other. Very dangerous phenomenon. If you read the New York Times or the Washington Post or CNN, you're getting a filtered version of the news, but at least there's some variety. It's not one voice over and over. So you can get somewhat different points of view. It can lead you to search further in ways that the internet does allow. But if you don't use those resources, you just get trapped into bubbles where you're talking to somebody who agrees with you and you both agree and you don't hear what's going on in the outside world. So it can be valuable, but it depends how you use it. My general feeling is it's having a negative effect. There are actually colleges now, maybe yours is among them, where plaques are being put in the sidewalks saying, look up, meaning don't just look at that thing in your hand, but pretend there are other human beings around who you ought to talk to. And it's not a joke. You can go into a McDonald's these days and see a bunch of kids sitting around a table eating a hamburger, and there's two conversations going on. The one that's going on around the table and the one that each one of them is having in their own private world on their smartphone or something. That's not human interaction. I know young people, some even my own family, who think they have hundreds of friends because when they put up something on Facebook that says, I'm going to have an exam tomorrow, they get 100 people saying, gee, I hope you do well. That's not having a friend, you know. I think it's having a very vulgarizing effect. But it's your life, so you have to decide if you like it or not. It's not my life. I don't use social media.
Thank
you. So based on what you've studied and theorized about how humans acquire and learn language, what do you think that means for the future of AI and natural language processing? And is it possible to utilize theories about human language processing and acquisition to develop AI that can learn languages and understand different nuances in language and syntax, or is it even ethical to do that?
Well, there's something we should study understand about AI. There's actually two versions of AI. One version is basically cognitive science. That says, let's study problems of how the mind works, how intelligence works, how language works, and we'll happen to study it using computer modeling. That's one way to study the natural world. People like Noam Chomsky, one of the founders of AI, that was his conception of AI. And that's pretty much gone. By now, AI is mostly brute force. Let's see if we can accomplish some goal. You know, we'll get a machine to, meaning we'll get 500 grandmasters together to work for days and days and work out ways that we can then program so that the program will very likely defeat a grandmaster who only has 45 minutes to think instead of 5 weeks to think. That's called an achievement of AI. It's about as interesting as a bulldozer cleaning the street, you know. Yeah, it's a way of doing something, teaches nothing about anything. Natural language processing is mostly like that. It's brute force. It's using batches of supercomputers, endless amount of data to try to find patterns in language, which you can then use to sort of predict something that's likely to happen next. It's of absolutely no scientific interest, none. Doesn't tell you anything about humans, doesn't tell you anything about language. Now take the programs that get the headlines in the newspapers, a lot of excitement, like BERT, the latest rafts of supercomputers, uses up half the energy in Silicon Valley. And what it does is it sort of fills in what you're writing. So when you're writing something on the computer, it says, how about adding it this way? And very often it's kind of the way you would do it. So in fact, you get stories in the journals about how computers are going to write articles and so on and so forth. It's all zero. I mean, the system would work just as well on languages that are impossible for humans. It's easy to show that. Could go into details, but it's very easy to show. That tells you, it's telling you nothing about humans. It's kind of as if someone came into a physics conference and said, hey, I've got the answer. You can stop what you're doing. I got a great theory. 2 words, anything goes. That's my theory. That'll take care of everything that actually happens and everything that doesn't happen. So why don't you just take that? Well, that's approximately BERT. I can, with enormous computing capacity, way, eons beyond what any human uses or any other organism, I can get something for actual language and the same for impossible languages. So I've essentially done nothing. Now, it's not to say that it's not useful. Like I use the Google Translator. It's useful, even though it's of no scientific interest. It's just plain brute force. But it is useful. Bulldozers are useful too. I'd rather have them clear the snow from my street than having to do it myself. So it's nice to have things around that are useful, but we shouldn't confuse it with science. It has nothing to do with science. Now, could AI go in the direction that, say, people like Chomsky wanted? Could it be a way of studying actual human or other organisms' intellectual capacity? Sure. Computer modeling is often a good way to study topics. You can get things that way that you can't get in other ways. Okay, but it's basically not what it's doing. So you can't really ask about AI learning languages or understanding languages. That's the kind of thing that organisms do. You can model it. You can try to find a model of it, but that's not doing it. And the way humans do it involves all sorts of things that you can never build into a program. When you understand what somebody's saying, you're bringing in very rich background, knowing how the world works, how it doesn't work, what kinds of things are likely to happen, what kind of society you're living in, where this person comes from. There's a ton of stuff like that that goes into understanding any simple sentence. And nobody can even dream of programming a computer for that. What you could get is some kind of analysis, which could be useful, of expressions, which could maybe teach you something about the theories of language. Like people develop theories of language all the time, like other theories. You can formalize them. Just remember what a computer program is. A computer program is nothing mystical. A computer program is a theory written in a funny notation so that computers can implement it. But it's a theory, like other theories. And sometimes theories are useful. Often, in fact, you can test out what their consequences are. If you want to write it in the notation for a computer, you can get the computer to find out its consequences. Now, that's a task that's not usually undertaken in the sciences, and there's a reason. In order to write a computer program, you have to answer every possible question. You don't answer any question, the computer is going to crash. Now, in the sciences, you never know the answers to every question. You have answers to some questions, speculations about others are just mysteries. But if you're forced to formalize it into the notation for a program, you're going to have to answer questions you don't know the answers for. That's why it's rarely done in the sciences, only for narrow cases where you really do understand almost anything. It's that narrow. But I think that kind of thing should be kept in mind. There's a lot of excitement about little robots, you know, R2D2, isn't he cute? He can do all these things. But you don't want to get caught up in that if you're thinking about AI as a serious topic.
Hey, Noam. I was wondering what your personal perspective on spirituality is.
On
Spirituality, if you like.
I didn't hear the last word, the important word.
Spirituality.
Mutuality?
Spirituality.
Spirituality.
Yeah. Do you have any sort of
It's not part of my life. If it's important for other people, that's fine. You know, for a lot of people, it means a lot. I mean, take my grandfather, who was a first-generation immigrant from Eastern Europe, very Orthodox Jewish. It was his whole life. There was nothing else. All of his life was an offshoot of that. Okay, it's one way to live, not my way, but people want it, okay. I mean, I have friends who find when they go to church on Sunday morning, it's uplifting for them, it enriches their life, it gives them some meaning in their life. I've gone with friends to evangelical churches out of curiosity, where people speak in tongues and so on. It means a lot to the people who are there. You know, humans are complicated creatures. If that means a lot to somebody, it's fine with me, as long as they don't try to impose it on anyone else. When evangelicals try to impose their beliefs on the rest of the society, as happens in the United States, that's a different story, or in Brazil or other places. But if that's the way they want to live, it's fine.
Thank you.
All right, do we have time for one more, or is it best to wrap it here?
Hi, Noam Chomsky, it is an honor to meet you, and you can be as brief as you want in your answer to this. But I just want to know if you think there's any hope for the American healthcare system, or if you think corporate America has won this one.
I don't think they've won the war. I mean, we've been through 40 years in which enormous power has been taken away from people and placed in the hands of corporations. Very conscious, careful program. Let's go back to 1980, before your day, but you can remember. Ronald Reagan came into office, 1981, made an inaugural speech. The inaugural speech had a slogan, said, "Government is the problem, not the solution." He went on to elaborate. What does it mean to say government is the problem, not the solution? There are decisions to be made in the society about how it works. If government is not making them, somebody else is making them. Well, what's government? To some extent, at least, not enough, but to some extent, government is responsive to the general population. It's accountable to the population. What Reagan is saying was, not him, but the people who was writing his speeches for him. He was just an actor reading words. But the people who were writing the speeches for him were saying decisions could be taken away from government, which has the flaw that it's responsive to people, and should be placed in the hands of unaccountable private tyrannies, the corporate sector, totally unaccountable to anybody. And what do? Well, there was a guru, an economics guru, who was the spokesperson for the new neoliberal period, Milton Friedman. You can read him, so-called libertarian economist. His doctrine, clear, open, right in public, no secret, is corporations have one goal: to enrich themselves. They don't have any responsibility to anyone else, which is an interesting idea. It doesn't come from economics. It's an ethical claim. The right to incorporate is granted by the public, and it's a gift from the public. If you don't want that gift, don't take it and just keep to a partnership. But if you want the gift of incorporation, the public is giving it to you, and it's a very extensive gift. Friedman is saying, we don't have any responsibility. Corporations just take the gift and go on to enrich themselves. Well, put those two theses together. Is it very hard to figure out what's going to happen? Well, we now have 40 years in which we see what happened. Just to give one measure of it, the Rand Corporation, very respectable government-linked corporation, just did an extensive study in which they tried to estimate the wealth that had been transferred from the lower 90% of the population to the top, actually fraction of 1% during these 40 years. Now their estimate is $47 trillion a year, not small change. And that's a vast underestimate. They didn't look at other things. When Reagan came into office, his managers, the people who were working out these programs, opened the spigots on all sorts of activities that were illegal before and barred before by Treasury enforcement, like tax havens. They were illegal before, and the Treasury Department prevented them. You had to pay your taxes here. Well, you can figure out what that would happen. Apple, biggest corporation, has its offices in Ireland. They don't bother paying taxes. They get the benefits of incorporation here, but they don't have to pay taxes. Many others the same. That's hard to estimate because it's all in secret. These are secret tyrannical organizations, but there are fair estimates, even by the IMF. It runs to tens of trillions of dollars. And it also institutes a race to the bottom because countries try to lower their corporate tax rates so that corporations won't leave and go somewhere else. Okay? That has an effect on the total tax structure. For the first time in over a century in the United States, billionaires are paying a lower tax rate than people who work for them. Okay. The other thing that Reagan's managers instituted was destroy labor unions. That's very important. When you're going to rob the population blind, you have to stop them, keep them from having a way to defend themselves. So the Reagan administration began with a huge assault on labor. Same with Thatcher in England, where they were following the same policies. By now, unions have almost been destroyed. And there's an effect. Unions are the means, the one major means by which working people can defend themselves against the onslaught of class war by the owners of the society. As unions decline, inequality goes up. Unions go down, up, inequality goes down. Unions decline, minimum wage declines. It's almost a straight line. By now, unions are so broken that there are barely any strikes anymore, no labor actions. Okay, all of these are policy decisions. They didn't have to be this way. It's not, the Democrats cooperated, incidentally. Clinton was active in escalating all of these processes, same with Obama. Not as much as the Republicans who've gone off the rail, but to a large extent. All of this can be reversed, and we can move to a much better world than ever existed. The game isn't over by any means. And there have been other times which were similar to this. When I was born, 1920s, labor had been totally crushed. It was the Gilded Age. Inequality was like today. No limits on enriching yourself. That was the 1920s. 1930s, all changed. Labor reconstituted, labor actions took place, moderately sympathetic administration. You got the New Deal, limited form of social democracy, and we're still benefiting from it. Everything from the TVA to Social Security can all be done. No reason why that shouldn't happen again. It's happened before in theory. I mean, class war goes on all the time. The business world, you have to bear in mind, is dedicated Marxists. They're all dedicated Marxists. They believe in class war, relentless class war, in which their class has to win. Okay, values inverted, but basically the same conception of the world. If they're the only ones fighting the class war, they win. But they don't have to be. Plenty of young people and others are going in the other direction very significantly. And that's the reason why Biden has, who's a conservative Democrat his whole life, Clintonite conservative, he now has the most progressive program of any Democrat probably since Roosevelt, because of the constant pressure on him from people, mainly young people. Okay, that can go on. Afraid I have to leave.
Thank you so much.
No, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. So, all right, farewell.